The story for Poppy Playtime may have just been solved yesterday, with many clues and secrets being discovered that point to the main protagonist and hero of the game being none other than the prototype. So basically, for some context, yesterday the man himself, MatPat, released the highly awaited theory on the game Project Playtime. And in it, MatPat pointed out a ton of interesting clues that I wanted to talk about and expand upon today that I completely missed in all of my other theories, because he got a lot of things right and also a couple things that I think he got wrong. So for the most part, the video just talks about the ARG and whatnot, which is old news at this point, although he does give me a mention, which about made me cry. However, the most important part that I needed to point out here was in the middle of the video, he makes the bold claim that the prototype, you know, the main enemy of the Poppy Playtime series, who was responsible for supposedly letting all the toys loose and killing all the employees in the factory, was actually apparently meant to be the hero of the franchise all along. And while this claim on its own sounds crazy, he backs it up with mountains of proof. So as you probably already know, the whole theme around Project Playtime, the Poppy Playtime spinoff, is security. And in the unlockable VHS tape, we hear about the Bigger Bodies Initiative, which told us that Huggy Wuggy, Mommy Longlegs, and every other creation in Playtime Co. were specifically created to help out in the factory, and also to avoid having to hire outside employees who could potentially leak all their secrets while working. Simple enough. However, something MatPat pointed out in his video that I completely forgot about is that in the tutorial for Project Playtime, we hear a mysterious voice who tells us how to play the game as the monster from the perspective of Huggy Wuggy specifically. Now, I initially thought this was completely uncanon since I checked the credits and they don't credit the voice actor as anything other than the monster voice. However, a theory I saw running about at the time is that what if this voice is actually the up to this point speechless prototype who we saw at the end of chapter 2? It would definitely make a lot of sense, especially since there's this seemingly out of place image in Project Playtime of the prototype specifically controlling the toys. And as we hear in the tutorial, whoever is talking to us is literally guiding us through the factory in a similar way to this screenshot. So it seems to line up story-wise since clearly they gave us this image for a specific reason. Now, this is definitely still speculative, but assuming this is all true, this proves to us that the prototype was trying to help all the toys in the factory like what we thought, which initially seems like a bad thing. However, in the tutorial, the prototype makes his goals pretty clear, saying that they, being the employees, are trying to build more toys like you. You, of course, being Huggy Wuggy, which is weird because that means the prototype is trying to warn the monsters in the factory to stop them from making more of them. It, on the surface, seems really confusing because if you were a monster, why would you want them to stop making more of you? It doesn't really make much sense. However, what's important to point out is that assuming the orphanage program in the game was used to find children and experiment on them to create the real-life toys, which is almost 100% confirmed, that means that every single toy from Huggy Wuggy to Boxy Boo were simply just innocent children who were forcefully experimented on to become these vicious beings that end up attacking us throughout the game. And it's not like the children wanted to be turned into the monsters, they were literally forced by the scientists in the factory out of their will. So with that being said, the prototype isn't talking to the monsters, but rather the children who were turned into them. And so with that being said, the prototype guiding these monsters in the tutorial to go and attack everyone in the factory wasn't him being evil, but rather it was the prototype attempting to stop all of the experimentation going on in Playtime Co. And while for forever now we thought that Playtime Co was being overrun by these monsters because they went rogue or something like that, it actually seems like this was a planned move from the prototype to stop any more children from being experimented on by shutting the entire factory down. This theory, in my opinion, explains the plot of Project Playtime pretty well from the perspective of the monsters, and it explains why they attacked in the first place. Now, that's pretty much where MatPat's theory video ends. However, before he ends the video, he also makes a very bold claim. He theorized that with all this information, he came to the conclusion that the prototype was actually none other than Elliot Ludwig, the founder of Playtime Co., saying that as the prototype, he was attempting to save his own company after being experimented on himself, which would explain why he convinces Mommy Longlegs to capture Poppy in the first place. So that way he could hopefully reunite himself with his own daughter, because if you didn't know, Poppy is often theorized to be Elliot Ludwig's daughter who died and was brought back to life with the Poppy flower. And this would also explain why the prototype fights back against the experiments going on in the factory, because after all, if he really was Elliot Ludwig and had to watch his own company doing all this stuff to innocent orphans in the factory, he'd obviously retaliate. It's a really bold claim to make, and to be honest, I actually think MatPat got this part wrong, at least kind of. See, throughout the game, the prototype itself is often displayed as a failed experiment of some sorts. Not in the way that the dead rats found in chapter 2 were, where they simply just didn't work or anything, but rather when making the prototype, the employees accidentally made him superhumanly smart, being able to do a lot of the things that none of the other experiments inside of Playtime Co could ever do. Evident by the fact that he literally was the one responsible for turning all the experiments against the factory, leading to all the employees dying, as we now know. However, if the prototype really was Elliot Ludwig and there was some sort of dark plot by the other employees to kill Elliot so that way they could turn his factory into a science lab that uses children for experiments to maximize profits, the one question that sort of destroys this entire theory, in my opinion, is why? You see, we know that there are a lot of shady people in the company who are literally willing to kill to get what they want. After all, they literally made a whole monster for it in Boxy Boo, who killed people like Rowan Stoll. So if they really wanted to get rid of Elliot, why would they turn him into some weird half-robot, half-human contraption rather than just simply killing him? Well, in my opinion, the answer is simple. The prototype can't be Elliot Ludwig, and this theory is just wrong. But while I don't think this theory is right, using little pieces of it, I think I've developed a better theory that 100% is true. And my own theory suggests that Elliot Ludwig wasn't experimented on and turned into the prototype at all, but he rather just died of natural unrelated causes, which gave power to some unknown person who was the one responsible for taking the factory down. You see, Playtime Co was founded in 1930, which was the same year that Elliot Ludwig actually got divorced with his wife Molly. So to sort of just get an estimation of his age, the median age that people get married in the United States is around 28 years old. And Elliot was probably with his wife for a few years before getting divorced, so let's just round up to say he was probably around 30 years of age when he started Playtime Co, which is a very generous estimation. And while we don't know exactly when the prototype was created, Huggy Wuggy himself was created in 1984, and he's about 100 experiments after the prototype. So with that being said, he was most likely created in the very early 80s. And jumping back to Elliot Ludwig, using the average male life expectancy of 77 years, Elliot Ludwig, by the time the prototype was created, probably was either dead or was most certainly retired. And so with that being said, I really don't think they killed him to create the prototype at all. However, I do still think something fishy happened in the company, and here's what I mean. The Bigger Bodies initiative clearly has a more sinister purpose than what's shown on the surface. It's the thing that was responsible for these big toys in the factory and was developed in the later parts of the company's lifespan, with Huggy Wuggy's version being created in the 80s and Mommy Longlegs created in the 90s. There are some other toys like Boxy Boo who we see in the game who were created way earlier in like the 60s. However, there's a distinguishable difference between when the toy was created and when the bigger body itself was created, with the Project Playtime monster description specifically saying that Mommy Longlegs was created as a bigger body in 1991, while Boxy Boo was just based on a toy created years previously. So with all this being said, we know that Elliot Ludwig probably had nothing to do with any of this, because assuming natural aging, he probably didn't leave the company or die of natural causes, like we said, until the early 80s, which just so happens to be the same time the Bigger Bodies initiative started and the prototype was created. However, rather than assuming that the prototype was some sort of weird changed form of Elliot or anything like that, what I think is that maybe when Elliot Ludwig left the company because he got too old, he had passed the torch of the company down to somebody else. And whoever that somebody else was may have had darker intentions with the factory. See, Elliot is theorized to have used experimentation before, specifically when creating Poppy, who is supposed to be his daughter, but it was only for that one very harmless reason and nothing else. However, what if whoever he passed the torch to, whether it be Leith Pierre or another higher up in the factory, had other ideas on what to do with this power to experiment on other different things, and wanted to use it to produce extra profits in the factory after being confronted with the idea to create these things by the doctor from the VHS tape, who originally proposed the Bigger Bodies initiative entirely. This makes a lot of sense since we see this paper in chapter 2 that talks about experimenting on rats with poppies to create life. And I think what this shows is that whoever Elliot passed the torch down to didn't have the same know-how of Ludwig to create lifelike toys like Poppy, and therefore used distinguishable traits about her, like her being named after a poppy flower, and tried to use those elements to create other life forms to initially little success. That is until eventually they have a breakthrough somehow. See, somewhere in between experiment A14 and experiment 1006, they figured out how to add life to inanimate objects, with the creation of the prototype who is alive but is still very much mechanically based. However, it wouldn't be until experiment 1170 being Huggy Wuggy where they would perfect this sentient but obedient creature that they had power over. However, the problem is when they developed the prototype, it was clear that he was more sentient than the rest. And naturally, the smarter he was, the more observant he became to his own surroundings. We know from Project Playtime that the toys were often stored in closed off, almost torture-like chambers. And from the perspective of an almost human-like being in the prototype, this would be psychological torture. Being forced to watch innocent people like yourself be experimented on and turned into these demonic beings used to work as slaves while being stuck in a box of your own. The prototype most likely grew resentful towards the employees after having to watch all of this, and therefore when he had the chance, he gathered up all of the people affected by the scientists' experiments and used them against the factory to try and shut it down at all costs. But if everything I just said is true, it then brings up one more question. If the prototype was saving all of these monsters from being experimented on, then how come in chapter 2 does Mommy Longlegs cry in fear of being made a part of him as he's being killed? Because if he was trying to help them, then why was she scared? Well, it's because I don't think that Mommy Longlegs or any of the other toys for that matter exactly trusted the prototype, and for obvious reasons. The employees in the factory in a way sort of gave these toys life through experimentation, and to have the prototype come in to say it's all a lie and even tell them to attack the people who originally gave them life would obviously not be very convincing. And you know damn well that the employees of Playtime Co probably used tons of mental manipulation against these toys. After all, they literally praised Huggy Wuggy initially because he was the most obedient and listened to their orders. So clearly these toys had a lot of respect for their creators despite them being horrible people, explaining their fear when they were killed and the prototype was there to collect all their remains. That's my theory, but let me know your thoughts, subscribe, and peace.